We're continuing our series in John's Gospel as we look at what John has to say about Jesus, who he is, what he's here for. We know that John wrote in John 20 that he wrote it so that we might believe that Jesus is the Son of God. We've now moving into chapters 8 and 9, and the focus of these two chapters is on Jesus as the light of the world. It starts with Jesus in prayer on the Mount of Olives, a cool place for him to start. What place does prayer have in my life and yours? But then we move into one of the key scenes of these two chapters. It's a debatable scene in as much as it's not clear that this was in the original manuscripts, and you'll find it noted as such in your Bible. Nonetheless, it seems to conform with the general theology of the Bible and practice of Jesus, so it seems reasonable for us to continue to take it into account and to consider it in our thinking. This is about a guilty woman. She is brought before the authorities and they bring her before Jesus to say that she is someone who's been caught red-handed in adultery. Now, it's interesting how the leaders use the Bible in this, because they quote from Deuteronomy 22, but they only take part of those verses. In reality, they should have been bringing both parties in an adultery case, and both should be stoned, but only if actually they are only engaged or betrothed, not if they're actually married. So it seems that they're rather taking things into their own hands. They're setting this as a trap for Jesus, because while maybe in their law it indicates such a person should be executed, the Jews were forbidden from executing by the Roman authorities. It had to be something that went through them, hence the trials related to Jesus' crucifixion. Faced with this, Jesus says, let he who is without sin throw the first stone. And this is a light cast. This is the sort of light that Jesus casts across the leaders, as they realise that actually they are not without sin. They're not in a position to judge others and to condemn others, and so they leave. Of course, then Jesus says to the woman, then neither do I condemn you. What a wonderful light into her life. Suddenly her guilt is set to one side. Jesus is not going to condemn her at all, rather he sheds the light of forgiveness. But then he gives that clear call to her too, that she should continue to live in that light, namely she should leave a life of sin. We then move on to the second episode, which Jesus clearly says in this, I am the light of the world. The first thing that's considered is Jesus' credibility. Why should they take what Jesus says? Well, Jesus explains that what he says is valid because, first of all, he knows where he's come from and he knows where he is going, whereas they don't know such things about him. And we find that in these chapters. It's an ongoing theme, a mystery that's continuing. But also is actually the Father is demonstrating by the works he does through Jesus that he is the light of the world. He then goes on to say that he's going to be lifted up, which is an entirely appropriate thing for a light. A light needs to be lifted up if it's to give light as it is required to do. And of course, the manner in which Jesus is going to be lifted up is that on the cross. And what we find on the cross is that Jesus takes the guilt and brings forgiveness of sin. This is an incredible light, but given the story we've just looked at about the guilty woman, we find that this just fits beautifully in the whole situation. Jesus then goes on to talk about truth and freedom. He says, if you know the truth, it will set you free. What's this going to set us free from? Well, he says, you are slaves to sin. The reality is the truth of Jesus Christ and what he has done on the cross actually sets us free, not only from the guilt of sin, but also from that slavery to sin, such that we are able to live lives which are free of sin and are the way of God. And then he continues with a simple statement that he is the one who is without sin. You can't place any charge on me, he says to the people around him. show that I've done something wrong. And of course they can't. That is in complete contrast to the situation we had with the woman, where he says, let you who is without sin cast the first stone. If anyone's to cast the first stone, it is Jesus. He's the one without sin. He is the light of the world. Sin is darkness. Light is forgiveness and freedom from sin. We then enter a third section of these couple of chapters, and the core of this is Jesus saying at the end of it, I am. First of all, though, we tackle the hypocrisy of the people. They count themselves as children of Abraham, and yet Jesus says to them, but you're not, because you don't do as Abraham would have done. And then they say, well, we're the children of God. But again, Jesus says, but you don't do as the children of God would do. In fact, he says, and this is pretty bold, you are the children of the devil. They then come back at him with a similar sort of thing as they accuse him of being demonic. And the Samaritan was basically just a term of abuse to say that you're not a true Jew. And so that they come with that. But Jesus counters again with actually, my words give life. That's Jesus' response. My words give life. And he ends up saying that actually even before Abraham was born, I am. These are phenomenal words. They express both the eternal nature of Jesus, that he was around over 2,000 years before this period when he was on earth, and that he is divine. I am was the name that God gave to Moses in Exodus chapter 3. And the Jews recognise this. This is a central claim of Jesus' divinity, because the Jews recognise this and they get ready to stone him. But he slips away. We then enter into another longish story about a blind man. A man who's born blind, and the question amongst the leaders is, who sinned, this man or his parents? And Jesus says, no, neither. This is done so that the work of God might be displayed. This is one of the little cameos we get of God and suffering, and why we encounter suffering in this world. It's not necessarily because we have sinned. But then we continue with Jesus declaring again that he is the light of the world. And he demonstrates that by bringing healing to the man who was born blind. He brings sight to him. The skeptics start to investigate it, and they're doing so very much with a view of trying to prove that it hasn't happened and that it's a con in some way. They do so partly by giving fear to the people, that the parents, that they will be thrown out of the synagogue. But then we find that Jesus re-meets with this man once again, and the man comes to realise and to even worship Jesus. He recognises he has true spiritual sight as to who Jesus is. Jesus is the light of the world. And Jesus concludes by saying, those who think they can see are actually blind. And those who are blind, he is enabling to see. So the question becomes this, in this whole section, is, am I receiving the light? Have I received the light of forgiveness? Have I received the light of being set free from sin? Am I living in the light as a child of God? In John chapter 1, we read that Jesus came so that we might have the right to be called the children of God. Am I living in that now? May God help us.